Welcome to the Sleepy Bat. Tonight we're not talking about monsters or heroes, we're going somewhere higher, to a mountain where the gods sit bored on golden thrones stirring up chaos just to pass the time. Because eternity, it's a long time to stay entertained. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it? Tonight, we're diving into the most chaotic, ridiculous, and downright dangerous moments in Greek mythology. Not the heroic quests or epic battles you learned about in school, but the times when Zeus, Poseidon, Ares, and the rest of the Olympian crew decided to cure their immortal boredom by turning the mortal world into their personal playground. Trust me. By the end of this, you'll understand why ancient Greeks spent so much time building temples and offering sacrifices. They weren't just being polite. They were desperately trying to keep their gods entertained enough to leave them alone. But first, let me paint you a picture of what divine boredom actually looks like. Imagine you're Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of the heavens. You've defeated the Titans, established order in the cosmos, and married your sister Hera, which seemed like a good idea at the time but now feels like a cosmic mistake. You're sitting on Mount Olympus watching the same sunrise you've seen for the past 1,000 years, listening to the same prayers from mortals asking for good weather or victory in battle. The nectar tastes flat. The ambrosia has lost its flavor. Even your thunderbolts feel routine. What do? Well, if you're Zeus, you start looking for distractions, and by distractions I mean mortal women who catch your eye. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The truth is, divine boredom wasn't just Zeus's problem. It was a pandemic across Mount Olympus. These gods had infinite time, unlimited power, and absolutely nothing meaningful to do with either. They'd already created the world, established natural laws, and set up their domains. Mission accomplished. Now what? This is where things get interesting because the Greek gods didn't handle boredom the way you or I might. They didn't pick up hobbies or start reading philosophy. They didn't meditate or work on self-improvement. Instead, they did what any group of immortal beings with the emotional maturity of teenagers would do. They started messing with people. For fun. Let's start with Zeus because honestly, his boredom-induced shenanigans could fill a library. Picture the most powerful being in the universe, sitting on his throne, drumming his fingers and thinking, you know what would be hilarious? If I turned into a swan and seduced that princess down there. And yes, that actually happened, multiple times with different animals. But here's what makes Zeus's story so fascinating. It wasn't just about conquest or power. The guy was genuinely desperately bored. He'd ruled the heavens for eons, settled cosmic disputes, and maintained order across the universe. He was the ultimate authority figure with no one to challenge him and nothing left to prove. So he started creating challenges for himself. Elaborate disguises, complex seduction schemes, and increasingly ridiculous transformations. Golden showers, white bulls, majestic swans. Each new form was more creative than the last, like he was competing in some sort of divine costume contest that only he knew about. The problem was, Zeus's entertainment came at a cost. Every mortal woman he pursued became a target for Hera's jealousy. Every illegitimate child he fathered became a hero with a tragic destiny. Every casual flirtation rippled through the mortal world like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves of consequence that would crash over entire civilizations. Take Io, for instance. She was just a priestess minding her own business, tending to Hera's temple when Zeus noticed her. Now a normal person might send flowers or write a poem. Zeus? He turned her into a cow. Not as a gift, mind you, but as a disguise to hide her from Hera. Imagine explaining that to your friends. Sorry I missed dinner. I was busy being livestock because the king of the gods was bored. But Zeus wasn't the only one struggling with immortal ennui. His brother Poseidon had his own unique approach to divine boredom. As god of the seas, earthquakes, and horses, Poseidon controlled forces that could reshape the world. But after you've created your 1,000th tsunami and caused your 10,000th earthquake, even natural disasters start to feel routine. So Poseidon got creative. He started taking sides in mortal conflicts, not because he cared about justice or honor, but because he was curious to see what would happen. The Trojan War. Poseidon was there, switching sides whenever things got too predictable. He'd help the Greeks one day, then mysteriously aid the Trojans the next, all while sitting back and watching the chaos unfold like it was his personal soap opera. But my favorite Poseidon story involves a city naming contest. Yes, you heard that right. A city naming contest. Athens was looking for a patron deity, and both Poseidon and Athena wanted the job. Instead of arm wrestling or having a civilized debate, they decided to have a gift-giving competition. Whoever gave the city the better present would become its patron. Poseidon went first. He struck the ground with his trident and created a spring of water. Pretty impressive, right? Fresh water in a coastal city would be incredibly valuable. There was just one problem: the water was salty, completely useless for drinking or irrigation. It was like giving someone a beautiful car with no engine. Technically impressive, but utterly pointless. Athena, being the goddess of wisdom, took a different approach. She planted an olive tree, simple, practical, and endlessly useful. The Athenians could eat the olives, use the oil for cooking and lamps, and trade the surplus for other goods. It was the perfect gift for a growing city. The mortals chose Athena, and Poseidon was furious. Not because he'd lost, but because he'd been out-clevered by his niece. His boredom had led him to create a useless salt spring, and now he had to live with the embarrassment. So what did he do? He flooded the surrounding plain. Because if you can't win gracefully, you might as well throw a divine temper tantrum. This is what divine boredom looked like in ancient Greece. Gods with infinite power and finite patience, turning their restlessness into elaborate pranks, petty competitions, and world-shaking tantrums. They weren't evil exactly, they were just bored, and when immortal beings get bored, mortals become their entertainment. But the story gets even more interesting when we look at Ares, the god of war. You'd think the personification of conflict would never be bored, right? There's always a war to fight, a battle to join, a conflict to escalate. But here's the thing about Ares that most people don't realize. He wasn't just the god of war, he was the god of the brutal, chaotic, senseless side of war. The kind of conflict that serves no purpose except destruction. And even destruction gets boring when you've been doing it for millennia. So Ares started looking for new ways to entertain himself. He began appearing on battlefields not to fight, but to observe. He'd watch mortal warriors clash, taking notes on their techniques, their courage, their fear. Sometimes he'd subtly influence the outcome, not to serve justice or achieve victory, but simply to see what would happen if he changed one small variable. What if this spear thrust missed by an inch? What if that shield broke at exactly the wrong moment? What if this particular soldier suddenly felt a surge of berserker rage? Ares treated mortal conflicts like a laboratory, conducting experiments in chaos and violence, all because he was desperately trying to find something, anything that would surprise him. The results were catastrophic. Battles that should have ended in hours stretched into days. Warriors who should have died quickly lingered in agony. Entire armies found themselves locked in conflicts they couldn't remember starting, fighting for causes they no longer understood, all because the god of war was bored and looking for something interesting to watch. But perhaps the most telling example of divine boredom comes from a story that doesn't involve any of the major gods at all. It's about Pan, the god of the wild, shepherds, and rustic music. Pan was a minor deity by Olympian standards, but his approach to boredom was uniquely creative. Pan lived in the forests and mountains far from the grand politics of Olympus. His days were spent playing his pipes, watching over flocks, and generally embodying the wild, untamed aspects of nature. It sounds peaceful, even idyllic, but immortal peace becomes immortal monotony faster than you might think. So Pan started pranking travelers. Not harmful pranks, mind you, but elaborate psychological games designed to test the limits of human sanity. He'd follow lone travelers through the woods just out of sight, making subtle noises that suggested something large and dangerous was stalking them. He'd play haunting melodies on his pipes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He'd create illusions that made familiar paths twist into impossible mazes. The word panic literally comes from Pan's name, because his boredom-induced games were so effective at inducing terror in mortals that they created an entirely new category of fear. Panic wasn't just being scared, it was being so overwhelmed by inexplicable dread that your mind simply shut down and your body took over. Running blindly through the forest with no destination except away. Pan thought this was hilarious. He'd watch mortals flee in terror from shadows and sounds that posed no real threat, and he'd laugh until tears ran down his goat-like face. It was all harmless fun from his perspective. He never actually hurt anyone. He just wanted to see how they'd react when their comfortable, predictable world suddenly became strange and threatening. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Pan's pranks weren't just random acts of mischief. They were carefully crafted psychological experiments. He was studying human nature, testing the boundaries between civilization and wildness, reason and instinct. His boredom had turned him into an immortal researcher, conducting field studies on the human condition. And the results of his research? Well, Pan discovered that humans were far more fragile than they appeared. Strip away their tools, their companions, their familiar surroundings, and even the bravest warriors would crumble into gibbering terror. But he also discovered that humans were remarkably adaptable. The same people who fled in panic from his illusions would return the next day, better prepared, more cautious, but still willing to venture into the wild. This fascinated Pan. Here were these short-lived, powerless creatures who knew the forest was dangerous, who had experienced firsthand the terror of being hunted by something they couldn't see or understand. And yet they kept coming back, not because they had to, but because something in their nature compelled them to explore, to test themselves against the unknown. Pan's boredom had led him to discover something profound about mortality. These brief, fragile lives burned brighter precisely because they were brief and fragile. Humans didn't have infinite time to perfect their courage or unlimited power to overcome their fears. They had to make do with what they had, and somehow that limitation made them more interesting than the gods who tormented them. But we're just getting started with our exploration of divine boredom. Because while Pan was conducting his psychological experiments in the wilderness, and Poseidon was flooding plains over naming contests, and Zeus was transforming into increasingly ridiculous animals, the other gods were developing their own unique approaches to immortal entertainment. And trust me, what happened next makes everything we've discussed so far look like a quiet afternoon tea party. Take Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. You'd think someone whose entire existence revolved around passion and desire would never run out of entertainment. After all, mortals were constantly falling in love, breaking up, getting married, having affairs. The drama was endless. But here's what nobody tells you about being the goddess of love. When you can make anyone fall in love with anyone else at any time, romance loses its mystery. Aphrodite had watched the same patterns play out for thousands of years. Boy meets girl, divine intervention ensures attraction, complications arise, tragedy or comedy ensues, repeat. It was like watching the same play performed by different actors every single night. Eventually, even the most passionate love stories start to feel like rehearsals. So Aphrodite decided to get creative. Instead of simply making people fall in love, she started experimenting with impossible attractions. What would happen if she made someone fall in love with a statue, or a tree? Or better yet, what if she made them fall in love with their own reflection? Enter Narcissus, a young man so beautiful that everyone who saw him fell instantly in love. But Narcissus rejected every suitor, male and female alike. He was cruel about it too, mocking their affections and laughing at their pain. This caught Aphrodite's attention. Here was someone who seemed immune to love's power. Someone who might actually surprise her. But instead of making Narcissus fall in love with another person, Aphrodite crafted something far more twisted. She led him to a perfectly still pool and made him fall in love with his own reflection. Not in a vain, self-admiring way, but with the genuine, desperate passion of someone who had found their soulmate. Narcissus would spend hours by that pool reaching for an image that would ripple away at his touch, declaring his love to someone who could never love him back because that someone was himself. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped living, consumed by a love that was literally impossible to consummate. Aphrodite watched this unfold with fascination. She'd created a perfect paradox. A love so pure and desperate that it destroyed the lover, yet so fundamentally flawed that it could never be fulfilled. It was like crafting a beautiful puzzle with no solution, a masterpiece designed to drive its observer mad. But the real genius of Aphrodite's experiment wasn't just the cruelty. It was the psychological complexity. She'd discovered that love wasn't just about attraction or compatibility. It was about the possibility of connection, the hope that someone else could truly see and accept you. Remove that possibility and love became a form of exquisite torture. Narcissus eventually died by that pool, and Aphrodite turned him into a flower, not as an act of mercy but as a monument to her own cleverness. Every spring when the narcissus bloomed, she could admire her handiwork, a beautiful flower that grew by water, forever reaching toward its own reflection. But Aphrodite wasn't finished exploring the darker possibilities of divine boredom. She discovered that love could be weaponized, turned into something that destroyed rather than created. And once you've had that realization, it's hard to go back to simple matchmaking. Her next target was Psyche, a mortal woman so beautiful that people were starting to worship her instead of Aphrodite. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was insulting. Mortals were supposed to admire beauty, not embody it so perfectly that they became competition for the gods. Aphrodite's plan was elegant in its cruelty. She sent her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with the most hideous creature he could find, a monster so revolting that her beauty would be wasted on someone who could never appreciate it. But Eros, either through clumsiness or rebellion, accidentally pricked himself with his own arrow while looking at Psyche. The god of love fell in love, and suddenly Aphrodite's simple revenge plot became something far more complex. Eros couldn't bear to see Psyche suffer, so he devised an elaborate scheme to marry her while keeping his identity secret. He would visit her only in darkness, making love to her every night but vanishing before dawn. Aphrodite watched this unfold with growing irritation. Her son had ruined her perfectly crafted punishment by introducing genuine affection into what was supposed to be a lesson in humility. But then she realized something interesting. This new situation was actually more entertaining than her original plan. Here was Psyche, living in a palace with an invisible husband who loved her completely but refused to let her see his face. She had everything she could want: luxury, passion, devotion. But she was slowly going mad from curiosity and loneliness. It was like having a perfect meal that you had to eat blindfolded, never knowing what you were tasting. Aphrodite began to see the artistic potential in this situation. She started subtly influencing Psyche's sisters, filling them with jealousy and suspicion. Why was Psyche so secretive about her husband? What was she hiding? Surely no normal man would refuse to be seen by his wife. The sisters convinced Psyche to light a lamp while Eros slept, to finally see the face of her mysterious husband. When she did, she discovered not a monster, but the most beautiful god in the pantheon. But her betrayal of his trust caused Eros to flee, leaving Psyche alone and pregnant with divine child. Now Aphrodite had created something truly complex. A love story where trust and curiosity were in conflict, where knowledge and happiness were mutually exclusive. She'd turned love into a philosophical dilemma. Is it better to be happy in ignorance or miserable in truth? But the goddess wasn't content to simply observe. She decided to make Psyche's suffering into a public spectacle. She gave the mortal woman a series of impossible tasks, each designed to humiliate and destroy her. Sort seeds that had been mixed together, gather golden fleece from violent rams, fetch water from the river Styx itself. Each task was a death sentence, But Psyche survived them all through a combination of divine intervention and sheer stubborn determination. And with each impossible victory, Aphrodite's boredom transformed into something else, genuine respect. Here was a mortal who refused to break, who would endure any suffering for love, who treated the gods' cruelest games as challenges to be overcome rather than punishments to be endured. Psyche had turned herself into the hero of her own story, and that was something Aphrodite had never seen before. The goddess of love realized she'd accidentally created something beautiful, not just a love story, but a transformation story. Psyche had evolved from a passive victim of divine attention into an active force of will and determination. She'd earned her happy ending through suffering, which made it infinitely more satisfying than the simple romances Aphrodite usually orchestrated. In the end, Aphrodite allowed Psyche to become immortal and marry Eros properly, but it wasn't an act of mercy. It was recognition of artistic achievement. Psyche had become the first mortal to turn divine boredom into personal growth, to transform the gods' entertainment into her own empowerment. Meanwhile, Apollo was dealing with his own unique form of immortal ennui. As the god of music, poetry, prophecy, and healing, he had responsibilities that should have kept him busy for eternity. But here's the problem with being the god of artistic inspiration. Eventually, you run out of things to be inspired by. Apollo had heard every possible combination of notes, read every variation of verse, seen every pattern of fate unfold. His lyre, once a source of infinite joy, now felt like a burden. The music he created was technically perfect but emotionally hollow. He was like a master chef who had lost his sense of taste, still capable of creating masterpieces but unable to enjoy them. So Apollo decided to challenge himself by teaching music to mortals, not as a gift, but as a competition. He would find the most talented human musicians and see if they could create something that would surprise him, something that would rekindle his passion for his own art. This led to the famous contest with Marsyas, a satyr who had found a flute discarded by Athena. Marsyas had taught himself to play with such skill that he began to believe he could match the gods themselves. When he challenged Apollo to a musical duel, the god was intrigued rather than offended. The contest was brutal. Not just because of the stakes, the winner could do whatever they wanted to the loser, but because of the intensity both musicians brought to their performance. Marsyas played with wild, primal passion, his music raw and emotional and utterly alive. Apollo responded with technical perfection, every note precisely calculated for maximum impact. For the first time in centuries, Apollo felt genuinely challenged. Marsyas wasn't just skilled, he was inspired in a way that Apollo had forgotten was possible. The satyr's music came from a place of desperate need, of mortal urgency, of someone who knew his life could end at any moment and was determined to make every note count. Apollo won, of course. He was a god, and gods don't lose contests to mortals. But his victory felt hollow. He'd defeated Marsyas through divine power, not superior artistry. In fact, he suspected that Marsyas might have been the better musician, at least in terms of emotional truth. The traditional punishment for challenging a god was death. But Apollo chose something far more cruel. He flayed Marsyas alive, slowly and methodically, as if he were preparing a sacrifice. But he kept the satyr conscious throughout the process, forcing him to experience every moment of agony. Why such extreme cruelty? Because Apollo realized that Marsyas had something he'd lost: the ability to create art that mattered. The satyr's music came from a place of vulnerability and mortality that Apollo could never access. Marsyas could create beauty because he knew it wouldn't last. Apollo could only create perfection because he had infinite time to refine it. The flaying wasn't just punishment. It was an attempt to understand what made mortal art so powerful. Apollo was literally trying to see what was inside Marsyas, what gave his music its desperate beauty. He was dissecting creativity itself, trying to find the source of inspiration he'd lost. But even as he tortured Marsyas, Apollo realized the futility of his search. The very act of trying to possess mortal creativity destroyed it. You can't capture the essence of mortality without killing it. You can't understand desperation without causing it. In the end, Apollo learned nothing from Marsyas's death except that some things are lost forever, and divine power can't bring them back. His boredom had led him to destroy the very thing that might have cured it. He'd committed the ultimate artistic sin. He'd silenced a voice that had something unique to say. But Apollo's story doesn't end there. His encounter with Marsyas changed him, made him more aware of what he'd lost and more desperate to find it again. He began seeking out other mortals who might challenge him, not in contests but in collaboration. He started appearing to poets and musicians not as a god demanding worship, but as a fellow artist seeking inspiration. This led to some of the most beautiful and tragic stories in all of mythology. Apollo would fall in love with mortal artists, not romantically but creatively. He would pour his divine knowledge into them, hoping to create something that combined immortal skill with mortal passion. But it never worked. The mortals would burn out from the intensity of divine inspiration, their brief lives unable to contain the artistic fire Apollo shared with them. They would create masterpieces and then die, leaving Apollo alone again with his perfect empty music. Each failure deepened his boredom and his desperation. He began to understand that the problem wasn't his lack of inspiration. It was his immortality itself. He had infinite time to perfect his art, which meant he had no urgency to create anything meaningful. He could always improve it tomorrow, or next century, or next millennium. Mortals created beautiful art because they knew they would die. Their creativity was born from limitation, from the knowledge that they had only a brief window to express what was in their hearts. Apollo had no such limitation, and therefore no such motivation. This realization drove Apollo to even more extreme experiments with divine boredom. He began cursing mortals with the gift of prophecy, not to help them but to see how they would handle the burden of perfect knowledge. He created oracles who could see the future but were doomed to never be believed, or to speak only in riddles that no one could understand. His most famous oracle was Cassandra, a Trojan princess who rejected his romantic advances. As punishment, Apollo gave her the gift of prophecy but cursed her so that no one would ever believe her predictions. She would spend her life knowing exactly what disasters were coming and being powerless to prevent them. But this wasn't just revenge. It was another experiment in the relationship between knowledge and suffering. Apollo wanted to understand what it felt like to be trapped by your own insight, to know things that brought only pain and responsibility. He was using Cassandra to explore the dark side of his own divine nature. The results were exactly what he'd hoped for and more terrible than he'd imagined. Cassandra's suffering was exquisite and endless. She foresaw the fall of Troy, the death of her family, her own enslavement and murder. She tried desperately to warn people, but her curse made her seem mad, hysterical, untrustworthy. Apollo watched her anguish with fascination and growing horror. He'd created a perfect mirror of his own condition, someone trapped by supernatural knowledge, isolated by abilities that others couldn't understand, driven to desperation by the gap between what they knew and what they could do about it. In Cassandra, Apollo saw his own immortal boredom reflected back at him. She was cursed with too much knowledge, just as he was cursed with too much time. She was isolated by her gift, just as he was isolated by his divinity. Her prophecies were meaningless because no one would listen, just as his music was meaningless because it came too easily. But there was one crucial difference. Cassandra's curse would end with her death. Apollo's would last forever. This realization hit Apollo like a thunderbolt to the chest. He'd spent eons trying to understand mortal creativity, torturing and experimenting on humans to find the secret of their desperate beauty. But in cursing Cassandra, he'd accidentally created a perfect representation of his own divine prison. She was trapped by knowledge, he was trapped by eternity. She would die and find peace, he would continue forever in his golden cage of boredom. And that's when Apollo did something unprecedented for a Greek god. He tried to lift his own curse, not out of mercy but out of a desperate need to escape the mirror Cassandra had become. But here's the thing about divine curses, even gods can't undo them once they're spoken. The words had been bound with his own power, sealed with his own authority. He was as trapped by his curse as Cassandra was. For the first time in his immortal existence, Apollo understood what it meant to be powerless. He could move mountains, heal the sick, inspire the greatest artists in history. But he couldn't take back a few words spoken in anger. His omnipotence had limits, and those limits were defined by his own nature. This drove Apollo into a kind of divine madness. He began appearing to mortals not as a god, but as a fellow sufferer. He would sit with dying poets and whisper about the burden of creation. He would comfort grieving musicians by sharing his own stories of artistic emptiness. He was seeking therapy from the very people he'd been tormenting. But let's shift our focus to Hera, because her approach to divine boredom was perhaps the most psychologically complex of all the Olympians. As queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, Hera had a job that should have been fulfilling, protecting the sacred bonds between husbands and wives, ensuring the stability of families, nurturing the institution that held mortal society together. The problem was Zeus. Her own marriage was a catastrophic example of everything marriage shouldn't be. Her husband was a serial adulterer who transformed into animals to seduce mortal women. He fathered illegitimate children with nymphs, princesses, and occasionally pieces of furniture. He lied, cheated, and manipulated his way through affair after affair, then expected Hera to smile and play the supportive wife. But here's what made Hera's situation unique. She couldn't divorce him. Gods don't get divorced. They don't separate or take breaks or go to couples therapy. Divine marriage is eternal, which means Hera was stuck with Zeus forever, watching him humiliate her in front of the entire pantheon while she maintained the pretense of marital bliss. This created a special kind of boredom in Hera. She couldn't fix her own marriage, but she was still the goddess of marriage itself. She had to protect an institution that had failed her personally, maintain standards that her own husband ignored, and somehow find meaning in a role that felt like cosmic mockery. So Hera channeled her boredom into something far more sophisticated than Zeus's random seductions or Poseidon's petty competitions. She became a master of psychological warfare, turning her divine attention into a scalpel that could dissect the human psyche with surgical precision. Her target wasn't Zeus directly. He was too powerful and too shameless to be effectively punished. Instead, Hera focused on his lovers and their children. But she didn't just curse them or turn them into animals. She crafted elaborate psychological torments that revealed the deepest flaws in their characters. Take Hercules, Zeus's most famous illegitimate son. Hera could have killed him as a baby, but that would have been too simple. Instead, she waited until he was an adult, married, and settled into domestic happiness. Then she sent him a fit of madness that caused him to murder his own wife and children in a rage. When Hercules came to his senses and realized what he'd done, Hera didn't gloat or reveal her involvement. She simply watched as he struggled with the guilt and horror of his actions. The punishment wasn't the madness itself. It was the clarity that came after. The perfect memory of what he'd done and the knowledge that he could never undo it. But Hera's masterpiece was the 12 labors that followed. She didn't design them to kill Hercules, though they easily could have. She designed them to test whether someone could find redemption through suffering, whether a person could rebuild their identity after committing the unforgivable. Each labor was carefully crafted to mirror a different aspect of Hercules' character. The Nemean lion tested his strength, but also his willingness to face something that seemed invincible. The Hydra challenged his problem-solving abilities while punishing him for focusing on symptoms rather than causes. The Augean stables forced him to clean up literal filth, just as he was trying to clean up the metaphorical filth of his past. Hera was conducting an experiment in human resilience. She wanted to know if someone could carry the weight of unforgivable sin and still find a way to be heroic. She was exploring the possibility of redemption not because she believed in it, but because she was desperately curious about whether it was possible. The results fascinated her. Hercules didn't just complete the labors, he transformed through them. Each impossible task stripped away another layer of his old identity until he emerged as something new. Not the man who had killed his family, but the hero who had chosen to carry that burden while still trying to help others. In watching Hercules' journey, Hera discovered something profound about suffering and growth. Pain could be transformative if it was chosen rather than simply endured. The labors worked because Hercules had volunteered for them, seeking redemption rather than simply accepting punishment. This gave Hera an idea. What if she could apply this principle to her own situation? She couldn't change Zeus or escape her marriage, but she could choose how to respond to her circumstances. She could transform her role from victim to artist, using her divine power to create something meaningful from her suffering. Hera began to see her persecution of Zeus's lovers not as petty revenge, but as a form of divine drama. She was crafting stories about the consequences of betrayal, the price of desire, the complexity of human nature. Each curse was a chapter in an ongoing epic about the collision between divine power and mortal weakness. But the most interesting thing about Hera's approach was how it affected Zeus himself. At first, he barely noticed her elaborate punishments. His lovers suffered, his children faced impossible challenges. But he remained largely untouched. He could always find new distractions, new conquests, new ways to avoid confronting the consequences of his actions. But slowly, Zeus began to realize that Hera's curses were creating something he'd never seen before. Genuinely compelling stories. His casual seductions were becoming the foundation for epic tales of heroism, tragedy, and transformation. Perseus, Hercules, Helen of Troy. These weren't just his illegitimate children, they were the protagonists of myths that would outlive the gods themselves. Zeus found himself paying attention to these stories in a way he'd never paid attention to anything before. For the first time in eons, he was genuinely curious about how something would end. Would Hercules complete his labors? Would Perseus defeat Medusa? Would Helen's beauty really launch 1,000 ships? This created a strange dynamic between Zeus and Hera. His boredom had driven him to create chaos through his affairs, but her boredom had driven her to transform that chaos into narrative. They were accidentally collaborating on the greatest stories ever told, with Zeus providing the raw material and Hera providing the structure and meaning. But neither of them fully understood what they were creating. They were so focused on their individual responses to divine boredom that they missed the bigger picture. They were writing the mythological foundation for an entire civilization. Their personal dysfunction was becoming humanity's spiritual inheritance. This brings us to Athena, whose approach to divine boredom was perhaps the most constructive of all the Olympians. As the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, Athena had responsibilities that should have kept her intellectually engaged. She was supposed to guide heroes, inspire inventors, and generally advance human civilization through the application of divine intelligence. But here's the problem with being the goddess of wisdom. Eventually, you become too wise for your own good. Athena could see through every strategy, predict every outcome, solve every problem before it became truly challenging. She was like a chess master playing against beginners. Victory was guaranteed but meaningless. So Athena began looking for ways to create genuine intellectual challenges. She started appearing to mortals not as a goddess offering solutions, but as a teacher posing questions. She would present heroes with problems that had no clear answers, situations where wisdom meant choosing between competing goods rather than simply avoiding obvious evils. Her most famous experiment was with Odysseus, the hero of the Trojan War. Athena could have simply guided him home safely after the war ended, but that would have been boring. Instead, she decided to test whether human cleverness could match divine wisdom when faced with truly impossible circumstances. She allowed Odysseus to anger Poseidon, knowing it would curse him to wander the seas for years. Then she watched as he navigated challenge after challenge. The Cyclops, the Sirens, Circe, the Lotus Eaters. Each encounter was designed to test a different aspect of his intelligence and character. But here's what made Athena's experiment so sophisticated. She wasn't just testing Odysseus's ability to survive, she was testing his ability to remain human while using godlike cunning. Could he be clever enough to outwit monsters and gods without becoming monstrous himself? The journey revealed something fascinating about the relationship between wisdom and morality. Odysseus's cleverness allowed him to survive situations that would have killed a lesser man, but it also tempted him towards solutions that were effective but ethically questionable. He could lie, cheat, and manipulate his way out of danger, but each compromise cost him something essential. Athena watched this moral erosion with growing concern. She'd created a perfect test of human intelligence, but she was accidentally destroying the humanity of her test subject. Odysseus was becoming more like the gods he fought against, powerful, cunning, and increasingly detached from the moral constraints that defined mortal existence. This forced Athena to confront her own nature. She was the goddess of wisdom, but what was wisdom without compassion? She could solve any problem, but what was the point of solutions that ignored the human cost? Her divine intelligence was perfect, but it was also cold, calculating, and ultimately hollow. The realization transformed Athena's approach to divine boredom. Instead of creating challenges for their own sake, she began focusing on problems that mattered to mortals. She started inspiring inventors, guiding architects, and nurturing the kind of wisdom that built civilizations rather than simply winning battles. But the most profound change was in how she related to her own limitations. Athena began to see her divine perspective not as a source of superiority, but as a form of blindness. She could see the optimal solution to any problem, but she couldn't see why mortals might choose suboptimal solutions for reasons that had nothing to do with logic. This led to her most interesting experiment. She began deliberately limiting her own knowledge. She would approach problems from a mortal perspective, ignoring her divine insight and trying to solve them using only human reasoning. It was like a master surgeon trying to operate with gardening tools, technically possible, but requiring an entirely different kind of skill. The results were revelatory. When Athena thought like a mortal, she discovered that human solutions were often more elegant than divine ones. Mortals had to work within constraints that forced them to be creative, to find unexpected connections, to value things that gods took for granted. She realized that divine boredom wasn't just about having too much power. It was about having too few limitations. The gods were bored because they could do anything, which meant that nothing they did felt meaningful. Mortals were engaged because they couldn't do everything, which meant that what they could do mattered intensely. This insight would eventually lead to some of the most profound changes in how the gods related to humanity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because while Athena was discovering the value of limitation, another god was taking divine boredom to its logical extreme. Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and revelry, had a unique relationship with boredom. Unlike the other Olympians who saw their eternal existence as a burden, Dionysus embraced it as an opportunity for endless experimentation. He wasn't trying to escape boredom. He was trying to transform it into something beautiful and terrible. His approach was simple. If immortality meant infinite time, then he would use that time to explore every possible state of consciousness. He would experience every form of intoxication, every variety of madness, every permutation of ecstasy and despair. He would become a living catalog of human experience, pushed to its absolute limits. But Dionysus quickly discovered that divine consciousness was fundamentally different from mortal consciousness. Gods didn't get drunk the way humans did. They didn't experience madness as a loss of control, but as a different kind of clarity. What mortals saw as chaos, Dionysus saw as pattern. What they experienced as liberation, he experienced as just another form of divine order. So Dionysus began sharing his gifts with mortals, not out of generosity, but out of curiosity. He wanted to experience intoxication and madness through human consciousness, to see what these states felt like when filtered through mortal limitations and fears. The results were spectacular and terrifying. Dionysus's followers would enter states of divine possession that allowed them to experience godlike consciousness while still retaining their human vulnerability. They would dance until they collapsed, drink until they forgot their own names, and experience visions that revealed the hidden connections between all things. But this wasn't just a party. Dionysus was conducting research into the nature of consciousness itself. He was exploring the boundary between sanity and madness, between individual identity and collective experience, between the human and the divine. His most famous experiment involved King Pentheus of Thebes, who refused to acknowledge Dionysus's divinity. Instead of simply punishing the king, Dionysus decided to use him as a test subject. He filled the women of Thebes with divine madness, including Pentheus's own mother, and watched as they fled into the mountains to worship him. Pentheus followed them, hoping to spy on their rituals and gather evidence of their supposed immorality. But Dionysus had other plans. He gradually increased the intensity of the divine madness affecting the women, watching how it changed their behavior and their perception of reality. The experiment reached its climax when Pentheus's mother, completely lost in divine frenzy, tore him apart with her bare hands, believing he was a wild animal threatening her god. It was only after she brought his head back to the city as a trophy that she realized she had killed her own son. This wasn't just revenge. It was a carefully orchestrated study in the relationship between divine influence and human responsibility. Dionysus had created a situation where the women were simultaneously themselves and vessels for divine will. They were responsible for their actions, but those actions were driven by forces beyond their control. The tragedy revealed something profound about the nature of divine power. Gods didn't just influence mortals. They could temporarily transform them into extensions of divine will. But this transformation came at a cost. The mortals lost their individual agency while gaining access to superhuman abilities. Dionysus found this trade-off endlessly fascinating. He began appearing to different groups of mortals, each time adjusting the intensity and nature of his influence. He would make some followers ecstatic, others violent, still others prophetic. He was mapping the full spectrum of divine possession, cataloging every possible way that gods and mortals could intersect. But the most interesting discovery was that mortals seemed to crave this loss of individual identity. They would actively seek out Dionysus's influence, begging to be possessed by divine madness. They wanted to escape the burden of being human, even if it meant losing themselves in the process. This gave Dionysus a new understanding of divine boredom. The gods weren't just bored because they had too much power. They were bored because they were trapped in their individual identities. Zeus was always Zeus, Athena was always Athena, Poseidon was always Poseidon. They could never truly experience being someone else. But through his mortal followers, Dionysus could experience a kind of distributed consciousness. He could be himself and simultaneously be hundreds of different people, each one filtering divine experience through their unique mortal perspective. He had found a way to escape the prison of individual identity while still maintaining his divine nature. This realization would eventually lead to some of the most profound religious experiences in human history. But it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between gods and mortals. The Olympians were starting to understand that their boredom wasn't just a personal problem, it was a fundamental flaw in the nature of divinity itself, and that understanding would soon lead to consequences that none of them could have anticipated. The problem with Dionysus's discovery was that it created a new kind of divine addiction. Once he'd tasted the experience of distributed consciousness, of being simultaneously one and many, the old forms of entertainment seemed impossibly crude. Zeus's shape-shifting seductions, Poseidon's earthquake tantrums, even Hera's elaborate psychological torments, they all seemed like the games of children compared to the profound transformation Dionysus had achieved. But this breakthrough came with a price. The more Dionysus merged with mortal consciousness, the more he began to understand what he'd been missing as a god. Mortals didn't just experience emotions, they were shaped by them. They didn't just have thoughts. They were defined by their limitations. They didn't just face death, they were made beautiful by its inevitability. This revelation hit the pantheon like a thunderbolt. For the first time, the gods began to understand that their boredom wasn't just a side effect of immortality. It was a fundamental feature of divine existence. They were bored because they were complete, perfect, unchanging. They had achieved the ultimate goal of existence, and now they were trapped in that achievement forever. Mars, the god of war, was perhaps the most affected by this realization. Unlike his Greek counterpart Ares, who reveled in mindless violence, Mars had always seen himself as a force of necessary destruction. He brought war not for its own sake, but to clear away the old and make room for the new. He was change incarnate, the divine embodiment of progress through conflict. But if the gods themselves were incapable of meaningful change, what was the point of his existence? Mars began to see his role as cosmically absurd. He was the god of transformation, but he himself could never be transformed. He was the force that drove evolution, but he was exempt from its benefits. This paradox drove Mars to increasingly extreme experiments. He started appearing on battlefields not to influence the outcome, but to experience mortality firsthand. He would inhabit the bodies of dying warriors, feeling their pain, their fear, their desperate hope for survival. For brief moments, he could taste what it meant to be finite, vulnerable, capable of genuine change. The experience was intoxicating. Mars discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear. Honor wasn't an abstract concept. It was the choice to maintain your principles when abandoning them would be easier. Victory wasn't just about winning. It was about becoming something greater through the struggle. But these moments of mortal experience were fleeting. Mars would inhabit a warrior's consciousness for minutes or hours, then return to his divine state with perfect memory of what he'd lost. It was like being allowed to taste the most exquisite meal in existence, then being condemned to eat flavorless ambrosia for eternity. The torment of these brief experiences began to change Mars in ways that surprised even him. He started to develop something no god had ever possessed: genuine empathy, not the abstract concern of a ruler for his subjects, but the deep understanding that comes from shared experience. He had felt what it meant to be mortal, and that knowledge transformed how he saw his divine role. Mars began to appear to warriors not as a god demanding worship, but as a fellow soldier offering guidance. He would whisper tactics to young generals, inspire courage in frightened recruits, and comfort the dying with the knowledge that their sacrifice mattered. He was still the god of war, but he was also becoming something new, a god who understood the cost of his own domain. This transformation didn't go unnoticed by the other Olympians. Jupiter, watching his son's experiments with growing concern, decided to intervene. Not out of jealousy, but out of genuine worry. Mars was changing in ways that gods weren't supposed to change, developing qualities that threatened the fundamental order of divine existence. "You're becoming too attached to mortals," Jupiter warned during one of their rare conversations. "You're starting to think like them, feel like them. That's dangerous for a god." But Mars had tasted something Jupiter couldn't understand: the possibility of growth. "Maybe," he replied, "being dangerous is better than being bored." This exchange marked a turning point in the relationship between the older and younger gods. Jupiter represented the traditional view of divinity: eternal, unchanging, perfect. Mars represented something new: the possibility that gods could evolve, that immortality didn't have to mean stagnation. The conflict between these worldviews would soon spread throughout Olympus, but first, let's examine how another god was dealing with the same fundamental crisis. Mercury, the messenger god, had always been the most restless of the Olympians. His role required constant movement, endless communication, perpetual adaptation to new situations. If anyone should have been immune to divine boredom, it was Mercury. But Mercury's restlessness had become a prison. He could travel anywhere instantly, but everywhere felt the same. He could communicate with anyone, but every conversation followed predictable patterns. He could adapt to any situation, but his adaptability had become so perfect that nothing truly challenged him anymore. Mercury began to realize that his speed was actually a curse. He experienced life so rapidly that nothing had time to develop meaning. He would arrive at a destination before he could appreciate the journey. He would deliver messages before he could understand their significance. He was moving so fast through existence that he was missing existence itself. This realization led Mercury to try something unprecedented. He began deliberately slowing down, not just his physical speed, but his mental processing, his divine awareness. his ability to see all possibilities simultaneously. He started experiencing time the way mortals did, moment by moment with uncertainty about what would happen next. The results were revelatory. When Mercury experienced time at mortal speed, the world became fascinating again. A simple conversation could contain surprises. A routine journey could reveal unexpected beauty. Even mundane tasks became engaging when he couldn't instantly see their outcomes. But the most profound change was in how Mercury related to the messages he carried. When he slowed down enough to truly listen, he discovered that every message was actually multiple messages. The words themselves were only the surface layer. Beneath them were emotions, intentions, fears, hopes, and dreams. Each communication was a complex tapestry of human experience, and he'd been missing most of it by moving too fast. Mercury began to see his role not just as a messenger, but as a translator between different forms of consciousness. He was the bridge between divine and mortal understanding, between the eternal and the temporal, between the perfect and the flawed. And that bridge had been moving too fast to serve its purpose. This insight led Mercury to start spending more time with mortals, not as a god visiting from above, but as a fellow traveler on the road of existence. He would disguise himself as a wandering merchant, a traveling bard, or a simple courier, and engage with humans as an equal rather than a superior. The conversations he had in these disguises were unlike anything he'd experienced as a god. Mortals spoke to him with honesty, vulnerability, and genuine curiosity. They shared their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. They asked him questions that had no easy answers, posed problems that required creativity rather than just divine power. Mercury discovered that mortals were living in a state of constant creative tension. They were simultaneously limited and unlimited, finite and infinite, bound by their circumstances and free to transcend them. They were, in a sense, the perfect synthesis of divine and mortal qualities. This realization made Mercury reconsider the entire structure of divine existence. What if the gods had gotten it backward? What if perfection wasn't the goal but the obstacle? What if the divine state was actually a form of spiritual death, and mortality was the true expression of cosmic vitality? The implications were staggering. If Mercury was right, then the gods weren't the pinnacle of existence. They were its dead end. They had achieved everything and therefore could achieve nothing. They were complete and therefore could never grow. They were perfect and therefore could never become more than they were. This theory began to spread through Olympus like wildfire, carried by Mercury's messages and amplified by the growing dissatisfaction of the other gods. It wasn't just a philosophical curiosity. It was a potential revolution in how divinity itself was understood. But not everyone was ready to accept this radical reinterpretation of divine nature. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, had her own theories about the source of divine boredom, and they pointed in a completely different direction. Venus had always been the most sensual of the gods, the one most connected to physical pleasure and emotional intensity. If anyone should have been immune to boredom, it was the goddess whose very nature was about experiencing and creating passion. But Venus had discovered something disturbing about divine love. It was too easy. She could make anyone fall in love with anyone else. but manufactured love lacked the desperate beauty of genuine affection. She could create perfect physical beauty, but artificial perfection was somehow less compelling than natural imperfection. She could orchestrate ideal romantic scenarios, but scripted romance was hollow compared to the messy, unpredictable reality of mortal relationships. Venus began to realize that the most beautiful aspects of love were actually its flaws. The uncertainty, the vulnerability, the possibility of loss. These weren't bugs in the system, they were features. They were what made love matter, what gave it weight and meaning and the power to transform lives. This led Venus to a radical experiment. Instead of creating perfect love stories, she began creating imperfect ones. She would bring together mortals who were wrong for each other in obvious ways, then watch as they struggled to make their relationships work despite insurmountable obstacles. The results were heartbreaking and beautiful. Venus watched as star-crossed lovers found ways to connect across barriers of class, culture, and circumstance. She saw how the threat of separation made couples cherish their time together more intensely. She observed how the possibility of loss made people fight harder for what they had. But the most profound discovery was that imperfect love was actually more divine than perfect love. When mortals loved despite their flaws, despite their limitations, despite their mortality, they were achieving something that gods couldn't. They were choosing to love when not loving would be easier. Venus began to see divine love as a pale imitation of mortal love. Gods loved because it was their nature, because they were programmed to love, because they had no choice. Mortals loved because they decided to love, because they chose vulnerability over safety, because they embraced the risk of pain for the possibility of joy. This realization transformed Venus's approach to her divine role. She stopped trying to create perfect love stories and started trying to create opportunities for mortals to discover their own capacity for love. She would place obstacles in the path of couples, not to torment them, but to give them chances to prove their devotion to each other. The irony wasn't lost on Venus. She was the goddess of love, but she was learning about love from the very mortals she was supposed to guide. They were teaching her that love wasn't about perfection. It was about connection, commitment, and the courage to be vulnerable with another person. But Venus's experiments had an unexpected side effect. As she spent more time observing mortal love, she began to experience something she'd never felt before: loneliness. Not the simple desire for companionship, but the deep existential isolation that comes from being fundamentally different from everyone around you. Venus realized that she could create love, inspire love, and orchestrate love, but she couldn't truly experience it. Every relationship she entered was contaminated by the power imbalance between goddess and mortal. She was too perfect, too powerful, too divine to be truly vulnerable with anyone. This drove Venus to attempt something unprecedented. She began trying to make herself mortal. Not permanently, but temporarily, long enough to experience genuine love without the burden of divinity. She would suppress her divine nature, limit her powers, and make herself as human as possible. The experiments were only partially successful. Venus could reduce her divine abilities, but she couldn't eliminate the fundamental difference between her immortal nature and mortal existence. She was like an adult trying to play children's games. She could follow the rules, but she couldn't recapture the innocence that made the games meaningful. Still, these temporary mortal experiences gave Venus glimpses of what she'd been missing. She felt the flutter of uncertainty when approaching someone she found attractive. She experienced the joy of discovery when learning something new about a partner. She tasted the bittersweet sadness of knowing that even the most perfect moments would end. These experiences were so profound that Venus began to question whether divinity was really a gift or a curse. If the most beautiful aspects of existence were tied to limitation, vulnerability, and mortality, then perhaps the gods were the ones who were truly impoverished. This growing crisis of divine identity was beginning to affect the entire pantheon. The gods who had once seen themselves as the pinnacle of existence were starting to understand that they might actually be its prisoners. They had achieved everything and therefore could achieve nothing. They were complete and therefore could never grow. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. As the gods experimented with mortality, limitation, and genuine change, they began to discover something that would shake the very foundations of Olympus. They were starting to envy the mortals they had created. This envy wasn't simple jealousy. It was a deep, existential longing for something that seemed forever out of reach. The gods envied mortal vulnerability because it made courage possible. They envied mortal ignorance because it made discovery meaningful. They envied mortal mortality because it made every moment precious. Most of all, they envied mortal potential. Humans could become something more than they were. They could grow, change, evolve, transform themselves through their choices and experiences. They were works in progress, rough drafts that could be revised and improved. The gods, in contrast, were finished products. They were perfect, complete, unchanging. They had reached the end of their development before they'd even begun. They were like completed novels that could never be edited, paintings that could never be improved, songs that could never be rewritten. This envy began to manifest in increasingly desperate attempts to experience mortality. Neptune started spending more time underwater, not in his divine palace, but in the crushing depths where even gods could feel the weight of the ocean. He would hold his breath until his divine lungs burned, trying to experience the panic of drowning. The god of the sea discovered that pressure was one of the few things that could still affect him. In the deepest trenches, where the weight of water was almost infinite, Neptune could feel something approaching limitation. It wasn't true mortality, but it was the closest he could come to experiencing what it felt like to be constrained by physical reality. Neptune began to see the ocean not just as his domain, but as a metaphor for consciousness itself. The surface was bright and active, full of life and movement. But the depths were dark, mysterious, and largely unexplored. Most mortals lived on the surface, but the truly interesting discoveries happened in the depths. This led Neptune to start appearing to deep-sea divers, pearl fishers, and others who ventured into the ocean's depths. He would test their courage, their determination, their willingness to explore the unknown. He was searching for mortals who shared his fascination with the deep places of existence. But Neptune's most interesting experiment involved the creation of underwater cities. Not divine palaces, but mortal settlements that existed in the impossible space between air and water. These cities required their inhabitants to constantly adapt, to develop new ways of living that no surface dweller could imagine. Neptune watched these underwater civilizations with fascination. The people who lived there were forced to be creative, innovative, and collaborative in ways that surface dwellers never had to be. They were living proof that limitation could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The inhabitants of these cities developed new forms of art, new methods of communication, new ways of understanding the relationship between individual and community. They were evolving, becoming something more than ordinary humans, and they were doing it through embracing their limitations rather than trying to overcome them. Neptune began to realize that his divine power was actually holding him back. He could do anything, which meant that nothing he did mattered. The underwater cities were beautiful precisely because they were difficult to create and maintain. They required constant effort, constant adaptation, constant growth. This insight led Neptune to start limiting his own power when interacting with mortals. He would appear to them not as an omnipotent god, but as a fellow explorer of the deep places. He would share their struggles, their discoveries, their moments of triumph and failure. The experience was transformative. For the first time in his immortal existence, Neptune felt like he was truly living rather than just existing. He was growing, changing, becoming something more than he had been. He was experiencing the joy of limitation, the beauty of struggle, the satisfaction of earned achievement. But Neptune's experiments were just one part of a larger transformation that was beginning to sweep through Olympus. The gods were starting to understand that their boredom wasn't just a personal problem. It was a fundamental flaw in the nature of divinity itself. And as this understanding spread, it began to change. Not just how the gods saw themselves, but how they related to the mortals they had created. The relationship between divine and mortal was about to undergo a revolution that would reshape the very foundations of existence. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation in the history of mythology. The gods were about to discover that the cure for divine boredom wasn't more power, more perfection, or more control. It was something far more radical, the willingness to become less than they were in order to become more than they had ever imagined possible. But that transformation wouldn't come easily. It would require the gods to question everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence, divinity, and what it truly meant to be alive. And some of them wouldn't survive the process.